It's an honor, a pleasure to be here. I wish I were in Omaha, but circumstances did not permit that. So let me go ahead and start um, with my presentation. And let's see. Okay, so much research has been published in recent years on the topic of heritage speakers, especially in the field of Spanish learning and teaching because of the sheer numbers of students taking world language classes. Before this awareness and recognition of their presence in these classes, these students in, say, beginning or intermediate Spanish would be enrolled in classes with regular learners who didn't have any Spanish background and treated as if they were typical L2 learners. Although instructors were aware of their backgrounds and language learning issues that were different from those of typical L2 learners, those differences were largely ignored, and the students were taught and tested in the same way with the same rubrics as those used for typical learners. So you got people like Chich Marin in the 1970s, who lived nearby in my neighborhood in East LA, singing a song that said, Mexican Americans, they take Spanish in high school and get a C, even though they grew up in a Spanish-speaking household. But with the work of people like Valdez, Carrera, Potowski, and Lynch, the field of heritage language acquisition and teaching began to take a more definitive shape along with the research in this field. Now we know a lot more about this student population, and with the support of administrators who encourage the creation of separate language programs for them, more efforts to create materials for this population are encouraged and promoted. So my goal today is to get through some of what I consider to be the most important research and how it impacts teaching practices, or how it can do that. Let's start first with a few examples of heritage learners in Austin to show you how complicated it can be to figure out how to address some of the issues of students of this population when they learn their heritage language. Here are just 4 examples. First, you have Luis, a first-generation American, a dreamer born in Dallas, Texas, to Mexican Americans who immigrated illegally to the US. He has to negotiate the 2 languages and 2 cultures for their sake and that of his younger siblings. Since both of his parents work long hours, he has to cook for his siblings and help them with their homework, and they speak to him only in English. His parents haven't had the time to learn English, so he has to constantly switch back and forth from one language to the other. He feels that his Spanish isn't as strong as his English, especially regarding academic topics, and he has to search for words sometimes in Spanish. So often he just uses an English word and assumes that his parents will get the meaning. The second is Mina, born to Mexican American parents. She learned Spanish mostly from her paternal grandmother, who's from Mexico. Her grandmother lived in their home and didn't speak English at all, so she and her 2 sisters were obliged to speak it at least when the grandmother was present. She felt her Spanish was fine, judging from the feedback of her Spanish-speaking friends. But when she got to college and heard another type of Spanish being used in classes and around her, she started to feel self-conscious and shifted more to English. Although when she spoke to her friends at school, she switched back and forth between Spanish and English. John, in the third photo, the third from the left, is a 5th-generation Dominican American, and he doesn't believe you need to speak Spanish to be Hispanic. He took Spanish in high school and didn't do better than a few C's and very few B's, but then again, he didn't try very hard. He thought it would be easier since he had heard it around him in his town, and he understands informal language completely. He worked hard to get good grades in his other classes, and was class president, got into a good university where most of his friends have the same major, which is business, and happened to be non-Hispanics. But he did join the Hispanic business majors group, and he likes to go to their parties. So he enjoys that aspect of his social life connected with Hispanicity. And Katie is in the fourth picture, is a fourth generation Japanese American. Her mother and father were not Japanese speakers because they were the third generation and in the US and were themselves not taught the language because of World War II and anti-Japanese sentiments that her parents went through. But Katie became interested in her heritage after seeing some art films and taking a Japanese art class, which then led to her taking beginning Japanese. However, when her grandparents heard her efforts in Japanese, they laughed and made fun of her Americanized Japanese, which greatly humiliated and discouraged her from continuing to speak to them. Still, she kept up her efforts to learn the language, wanting to travel to Japan, but she didn't want to try to speak to her own family in the language. So basically, her use of Japanese was limited to classroom settings. So obviously there's a wide gamut of backgrounds among the population of heritage speakers of their heritage language. And there are many different definitions of heritage speakers. And here's one by Valdez. A student of a language raised in a home where non-English language is spoken, the student may speak or merely understand the heritage language and be to some degree bilingual in English and the heritage language. But until very recently, the most common situation in teaching them is to mix them in, as I said before, with regular L2 students. And in this country, that means English speakers learning a second language, and hope for the best while ignoring their differences and needs. Many of the pioneers of the field helped move the field forward, as I mentioned earlier, but one outcome of their work and administrative recognition at different schools of the different needs of these heritage learners is that there are now two separate tracks for heritage learners and L2 learners in many language programs. This was a big step forward. And the second step forward is that the research on heritage languages began to have an effect in guiding curricula and programs in general. But even then, as in all programs, there was still the problem of differences of individual students' backgrounds and their language proficiency in the heritage language. On either end in this continuum, you have a completely monolingual speaker in either, say, English, the dominant society language, or Spanish, the heritage language, which would be the minority language, probably acquired at home. And you have varying degrees of dominance in either language. A heritage speaker could be at any one of these points on this chart. But since proficiency of any language is dynamic and not static and could change along the way depending on their levels of contact with different speakers, this makes it really difficult for a teacher to look at her class list and figure out more or less what the language background and level of the students whom she guesses are heritage language speakers, because of their last name maybe, will be. So let's look at or think about the different attitudes that we've seen over the years towards a range of backgrounds and proficiency levels of heritage language students by educators and other students. The students, of course, immediately on the first day of class, start making comparisons as they sit there and they think, oh, he or she's better than I am, or I'm better than he is. Or they may just give up on doing well in the class altogether because everybody's better. There's a lot of anxiety in language classes, but maybe even more so in heritage language classes. For those students who come with linguistically motivated anxieties and even discrimination and stigmatization that they've had to deal with in the past, in or outside of the classroom. Parra states that given the heritage language students' lack of heritage language schooling, they're usually not equipped with things such as linguistic terminology, or what we call meta-language, necessary to talk about and identify lexical and grammatical features. And they're not familiar with academic and written language registers and rules of the language, of the heritage language. They may also have internalized a lot of negative attitudes towards their language and culture, depending on their history and the dominant language culture. And Parra points out that having heard the labels of familiar or colloquial given to their language variety, they may have come to view their own heritage language in the same way. So this suggests the role of attitudes by all parties involved towards the language variety in question, something in how the language is regarded, how or even if it should be maintained, and how one teaches it. So in this way, the heritage language is positioned with regard to the target language variety, and that plays a big factor not only in how it's taught, but in theory also how it's learned. So there are several issues that come up in the heritage language programs. One of them is, how do you address the different profiles, the student profiles, especially differences in proficiency in those classes. Of course, teachers have to have some kind of proficiency determination before the class begins to avoid too large a discrepancy of the proficiency if you have to have mixed classes. What should that proficiency scale look like, given that ACTFL and other organizations haven't really been successful in their attempts to create one? One suggestion is individualized instruction, in the sense of having to do certain activities at home or out of class to be able to attain a certain goal before beginning the class. But the proficiency level is a difficult problem, especially if there's no proficiency testing at all. Another problem is that heritage language students sometimes are so insecure about their level that they opt to take classes with regular L2 students so that they don't get a low grade. And they also get to avoid taking any kind of proficiency test. The second issue has to do with what we know about the heritage language population and their history in generalizations. And this sometimes has a relationship to historical events in some areas of the country. In Texas, the land used to belong to Mexico, and when Mexico lost the war, it became a US territory, and people suffered a lot of discrimination and had land taken away from them. So there's a negative history to begin with. Of course, in Texas, you're not supposed to mention at all the negative things that have happened historically, like racism. But in any case, Texas has a long history of contact with Mexico. Nebraska, and I don't know a lot about Nebraska, but it looks like a pure case of immigration, especially for jobs related to agriculture and meat processing industry, just like Kansas and the meat packing industry. Some heritage students want to learn more about their own identity and their history in terms of their cultural heritage, and talk about this in heritage language programs. Communities do have a cultural past, which could be a drawing point to attract students to heritage courses. There is also a strong connection, or there can be a strong connection to the language through community and cultural orientation or affiliation. One reason often cited for taking heritage language classes by the students is to connect with community and heritage and talk to family and friends, travel to the mother country. In other words, do some kind of process of self-discovery. Many programs try to make that connection between the student and the community, the history, the heritage, etc., and spin a positive orientation, and some of the negative history could also be shown. One example that I wanted to talk about is Mi Idioma, Mi Comunidad from Ohio State. I know there's a Ohio State alumni here. These are materials that reinforce that community connection with a lot of videos that show real heritage language students at Ohio State talking about different experiences, even though as they're taped, they're making a lot of grammatical mistakes and need to help in expressing the right Spanish word that they need. And I won't show you the example because it takes too long. But part of the course is to watch these videotape narratives of Latino students in Ohio. And the students talk about their experiences, their backgrounds. The idea is that some of these experiences will ring a bell with the students who watch the videos and get them to express about their own lives. Um, Unfortunately, the videos are not quite part of the whole lesson. The next section on grammar goes into discrete grammar points such as ser and estar, verbs that are unrelated. And here's a picture of one of the students, Victoria Colleen, who was born in Ohio at the Ohio State Hospital. And it tells her story and then has her talk a little bit about herself. Before the students see the videos, they're asked to focus on certain aspect of the student's talk, such as how she mixes Spanish and English. And this becomes a topic of discussion, as you see here. Notice the way she talks, mixing English and Spanish. What do you think of this? Do you do this? With whom? And then after they see it, they ask, do you identify with the same experiences as she does? How? And she mentions some student organizations at OSU. Have you sought out such a club? Are you a member of one? What are your positive and negative experiences as you participate as a student a Latino student at Ohio State? So the purpose is to bridge their experiences with the ones mentioned in the video and try to build a community and affiliation with that community. Okay, so the students then get a reading in the same program, get a reading about OSU Latino or Latina students and how they need support groups, what services are available to them. And then they do a project such as research some of the Latino organizations at your own school. What events do they have or will they have? What support services exist in the university or community for the Latinos. And other topics in this ebook are things like Mexican and Puerto Rican neighborhoods in Chicago, Latino festivals in the region, use of Spanish in my family and community, Latinos in Ohio. So it's very much trying to show or highlight the Latino communities and how they work in Ohio and get sort of a self-discovery that way. More ideas to foster connection to language via community and cultural affiliation are through storytelling and service learning. The OSU project has a project part on storytelling. I won't show you this, but it's a picture of Laura and her story of her family moving from Colombia to Ohio. And then she talks about memories of her life growing up in this country. Her Spanish is not perfect, of course, and that's part of the lesson. Students then see a series of questions that focus on one aspect that she mentions in the film. In this lesson, she talks a little bit about music and literature, so they start drawing on that to talk about that. Again, my criticism is that it's somewhat, this very interesting video story is somewhat decontextualized from the grammar that comes next, but that is built into the lesson. Some books skip this attempt to build a cultural affiliation and concentrate only on the language. The idea is this is what you don't know, so we'll focus on this. Or we might see some attempt at affiliation through homework, such as the unit on gender in society, such as investigate on the internet which resources your community offers to help people with gender problems, and make a list and share it with the class. And this is from Conectando con mi Herencia. Here's another example of the table of contents. You see the themes and reviews, again, focusing really on language, not on the people, but that's the author's choice. And one of them is Mi Mundo Hispano, My Hispanic World, which would seem to address the heritage situation. Then it goes into notions of grammar and language and talks about issues of grammar like orthography, very much focused on orthography um, in the whole book. So you see the author is really trying to tackle the most frequent problems of the heritage language and to teach meta language or language about language to the students. These are the grammar points, etc. And here's the reading and writing section, which comes next. Again, focus on language, like where does our language come from that we speak, the fusion of language, the third world language. How does language affect our ethical decisions, etc. Then reading, you have writing, the different grammar points. So looking at another book, The Language That We Inherit, this is the table of contents. The first two chapters in this book cover some heritage areas, let's say, and the rest of them focus on different countries, such as Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Salvador, Honduras. And in each chapter, they first look at a map, and then they read about the country, and the rest of the chapter is all on grammar, orthography, etc. So the emphasis is really still on the problems of the heritage language learner and to enrich their knowledge of the Hispanic world. That's the driving idea. Another book at the intermediate college level is this one, The Voices of Our World. And I thought this is a very interesting book, has a lot of interesting content. She tries to bring in the many voices of the Hispanic world in order to avoid stereotypes and to show the diversity of this world. In one segment, it begins with a video of this transsexual elderly person who tells her story of her home in Mexico City and how difficult it is to live safely and in peace in Mexico if you're elderly, and especially if you're transsexual. You can see here some of the questions the students are asked as they review the content of the video, with the final point being, what is home for an elderly person, and in particular for gays, and then also more particular for transsexuals. But then it shifts again to grammar to talk about said in style explicitly. But again, it's a very interesting concept. The point is to explore the students' own experiences and backgrounds, and then they move on to other types of media like songs, blogs, and then main readings that illustrate not only the theme that serve to inspire grammar, discourse analysis, and other linguistic information. This information is given explicitly with long explanations, and then students practice doing things in various forms, such as picture stories. They read a story and then they fill out a chart to diagram that story. So there's an attempt to personalize the work, also to get the students to do things like storytelling and tell their own stories. Here's an example from Chinese aimed at the high school level to get students involved in a project. And this one is part of what we would call project-based language learning. The students are to work on doing a workshop on American hip hop, which is very popular with the high school kids. And as a student leader at this school, you initiate a volunteer abroad program in China during the summer. You have to prepare a poster with all the information in English and Chinese to recruit volunteers who also study Chinese, and to do fundraising. You'll present in English during the lunch hour in the cafeteria, talking about your poster and convince students to sign up as volunteers. And on Sunday, you will take your presentation to the Asian Center and present in Chinese to a group of native Chinese speakers, expatriates at the Asian Center to fundraise. So you would need for materials a display board, poster, flyers in both languages. The information should include the location that these students are going to go to, where they'll live, what kind of volunteer work they would do. They have to do a little bit of research to do this. And then this presentation is going to be pitched to administrators, professors, parents, students, etc. The storytelling by the community really does get the connection to the student, to the community. And here's an example from Chinese again, as Chinese is a heritage language. We've been studying past tense forms to express past. Let's see how they're used in the community, within the Chinese speaker community, either in or outside of the university. Find a suitable speaker, and with your iPhone or computer, etc., record this speaker. You should ask him or her to tell you about an especially memorable moment, either good or bad, in his or her life in this community, and speak for about 10 minutes. And you can jump in now and then to ask a question or comment so they can use their Chinese to extend the talk a little bit more. So the fun part of this, I think, is that not only do they work on past tense formation and awareness of how it is used in that community, but also a community member perspective towards events, which culturally is very interesting. And again, working towards a common ground in experiences. An example of service learning. A service learning is a way to build a connection to the surrounding community. As most of us know, individuals who represent the heritage language or culture, and to instill pride in the heritage. It's service learning is if you're not familiar, is an organized course by which students go into the community or to individuals outside of the class to perform service to members of the community, and supposedly to speak in the target language there. This is an example of one of our composition and community service courses at UT, where students have to work at a site in the community for a minimum of 12 hours and write up many, many reflections in Spanish in journals as their class project. So in the third box, you see, in addition to 3 hours of class, they volunteer in a bilingual or Spanish language setting for 1 to 2 hours a week. And then they will also do a lot of writing and talking about ethics, socioeconomic issues, and personal experience of community service. So it's not just doing the service, but also thinking about more abstract and value-laden issues. They also take time for grammar review and practice. And in their final paper, they write several short reflection papers, and the teacher wants them to think of the community service as a type of field work or internship. So they are supposed to keep a journal of their dates and hours of service, and take notes on different interesting aspects that they notice as they work there. Here's the final paper assignment. You see, the teacher says, what have you learned about yourself and the community? What does the volunteer research experience mean to you? Has it helped you improve your Spanish, and in what ways? Has it helped you clarify, define, or expand your ethical orientation? How have your community service and our reading discussions modified your thoughts about immigration, gender, and race? And how does your service or academic work impact your future? So she's not just trying to get them into contact, but also to think about these other issues. The service learning sites that in Austin that the students go to work are training sites like computer classes, ESL classes or tutoring, refugee resettlement, legal aid services, schools, and food pantries. Um, I know in Omaha you have things like the Jocelyn Museum of Art, Completely Kids, and the Latino Center of the Midlands, and also the Intercultural Senior Center that could be tapped for this kind of service learning. I wanted to talk a little bit about Dr. Tokai Hatch's own service learning program, which I thought was really unique at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. She has a 5-week summer program in Soria, Spain. The students have language classes in the mornings in the university, and they do a homestay, 1 student per family, and also do service learning in the afternoon. So they're busy all day long. The students choose from sites related to nutrition, environment, ecology, tourism, education, etc. They get to choose. And the heritage learners that went on her last service learning all placed at the advanced course level, which was very fortunate because they got, I think, a lot out of the whole experience. They'd have to do 10 to 12 hours of service learning in the afternoons per week. So that's a lot of contact. Most of the students selected summer camps for children, a government training agency, ESL, or a nursing home, depending on their interests. But I should note here the context is not their own heritage language community, which would have been Mexico, but rather Spain. So there were some different dynamics going on there. I wanted to point out some of their reflections of those students. They were able to see, the ones who worked in this educational setting, how Spanish is taught to the kids. And somebody said, I wouldn't have seen this if I've only been in my language classes, which is true. Somebody else observed how children are spoken to by their teachers, which was different from how they're spoken to in the United States. That's a deep cultural difference. And also this person was amazed that all of the students of all ages, all of the children of all ages were grouped together, and they played together, and they got along together and talked to each other. And whereas in the United States, we would have divided them each up according to age level, excuse me. Another set of materials presents everything in a multimodal approach using modules, as you see here in Spanish for Spanish speakers of heritage Spanish by Casas. And this is a multimodal and modular organization. The modules you could see here, down here, the lecciones temáticas. The themes addressed are related to topics that the author projects will ring a bell, like equality, identity, justice, gender, society, emotions. And the multimodality, for example, in TED Talks that are incorporated into the lessons, and the use of modules to get things organized in e-format with links to take you to other sites that talk about grammar, like you see up here, grammar and orthography. Now I'm going to move into another group of projects that are called project-based learning. I'm taking this from Belpoliti's work. First of all, project-based language learning, defined by the National Foreign Language Research Center in Hawaii, defines it as experiences designed to engage learners with real-world issues, with meaningful target language use, and they're asked to construct products that have an authentic purpose purpose and are shared beyond the classroom with an audience. So again, there's that link to the community. To show you what she starts off with as an overview. Can you all see that? I hope. Yeah,
Yes.
okay. So you have the project-based language functions and the interdisciplinary content that the teacher's supposed to be aware of. And then it's interesting here at the bottom, the author wants the project organizer to think about the 21st century skills by ACTFL, which are communication, cultures, connections, comparisons, and communities. So all of that is supposed to be incorporated into designing the project for the students. Okay, going back to my PowerPoint. Oops. Yeah. Okay. So again, it's to connect the students with real world communities. Oops. Oops. Here's an example of the National Foreign Language Research Center website repository called Pebbles. You have for example, storybooks for Haiti and Napa. So this is aimed at a lower level, more probably middle school and high school, or even grammar school. Travel guides for elderly tourists from Japan. As you all know, a lot of tourists from Japan go to Hawaii, which is where this National Research Center is based. And they have a travel guide that they make up for the elderly in Japanese, and they distribute it to the Japanese tourists as they come in. Okay. So here's another one from her own, Belpoliti's own collection that I thought was interesting. And we'll look at this example.
We can't see the examples. I think you're only sharing the PowerPoint. Oh, no, we can see this one. Okay.
Can you now see it?
Yeah, we can see this one. The Google Doc didn't come up in the prior one.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Well, anyways, this is a project made by a student of Professor Belpoliti's, and he wanted to do a pamphlet, an introductory pamphlet to draw interest of the probably high school level students in this Museum of Fine Arts. So he picked what he thought was strange art pieces to show them. And the title is Strange Art That Makes You Think. So he says, welcome to this Museum of Fine Arts. I'm going to show you some Hispanic art. And the first one he shows is called Abstinence, Political Abstinence by Juan Capote, who's a Hispanic artist. And he shows how the artist has uses sign language to create the word politica, politics. And he asks you in a interactive fashion to take any of these letters and put the sign up here in this blank to create another word in Spanish. So as you can see, it's interactive in goal. The second one is Manhole, Hoyo de Hombre by Ivan Navarro from Chile. And the students are the viewers asked, how do you feel when you look at this hole? Are you nervous, curious, timid? Could you fit in this hole? Could a lot of people fit in this hole? And talk to your other friends, etc., about what they think and you think. Okay, and then he goes into more traditional art like this one by Velázquez, showing the one of the infantes, the child king, and his dwarf. And he asks them, describe how you would be as a king or a queen. Would you be strict? Would you have a lot of people around in your court? Would you live in a very fancy castle, etc.? And this last one I thought was interesting. He took Picasso's Bull series and he left the first and the last one empty, and asks the viewer to do the first one in this sequence and how it would look, and then the last one in the sequence. That I was trying to think how I would do that. That's pretty bare bones in the end. I don't know how I would do that. Okay, going back to my PowerPoint. Can you see this? Yeah, okay.
We see
right.
the example. Are you back to the PowerPoint?
Yeah. Can you see this?
We see the tourist guide for teens.
Yes, that's what I want you to see. Okay, so this this one was done by interesting enough, one group of high school students in Napa Valley, California, one group in Canada, in Ottawa, I think it was, and another in Marseille in France. And they were asked to do a tourist guide because usually teenagers don't think that where they live is very interesting. So they're supposed to find the most interesting things of their city and region and make up a pamphlet. And then all three groups are going to post it to the same place and talk about this in French. So they get them together with, the same purpose, but also to do a little bit of research on this, and they get to learn about the other cultures. These are some questions that could help you organize the project, and yeah, I'll see if I could get that here. Can you see this now?
So we see PBLL. Okay.
Yeah.
See the design? Yeah.
Okay, so this is the idea that Belpoliti put together for what are the things you need to have for a successful project-based language learning program. And you could see she builds in agency, or the student doing individual thinking, working, etc. Collaboration with others, critique and revision, reflection, a public product that could be shared with the public, and something that's challenging enough to be interesting. I wanted to scroll down a little bit to show you some interesting ideas she had at the end of this pamphlet. It's a very, very good resource, but you can see here some topics in design. So for bilingual worlds, she has them do an infographic to identify identities, a podcast, to build bridges, newsletters. So you see all of these ideas that make use of sort of an outward orientation. When I say outward, I mean outward into the community or the world through the internet or through other communities, etc. So yeah, I could leave you the website for this. Okay, let's go back to finishing up. Let's see. Okay. Wait, I don't want to be there. Where am I? My PowerPoint, there. Okay, so finally, I wanted to not say gracias, my issues. Some issues that come up sometimes when I talk about these things are, what about cultural orientations of the heritage students? Because some of them are not oriented to the heritage language culture, but rather to the American culture. So how could you get some way to affect their motivations and affordances for learning target language, and how do you get them interested in perceptions of the culture? And one idea that we've started to use are cultural questionnaires, where you have them answer questions, or get them to talk to people to answer questions about their culture, those who are really oriented to the heritage culture versus people who don't have a bilingual background, and see what kind of cultural answers you give on those. does it make a difference if we're talking about a second culture or a third culture or a fourth culture? Because some of our students now are multicultural, and we know by how they learn multi-languages that they learn them in different ways. So how about multicultures? Do they learn them in different ways? I think yes. I think they learn to do more and more analogy, comparison, but kind of boiling things down as the more savvy they get about how to learn a culture. And how do you motivate students to take heritage courses designed for them? That's a tough one because you have to overcome their fears and anxieties. First of all, you have to get them in your class, and then overcome those false perceptions of these students. And the ramifications of understanding the complexities of the population. How about those compositions of those groups and differences in the way they learn? And that is, I think, a major research question as we go forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dale. All right, so we're going to have a moment now for a Q&A. So please enter your questions then in the chat, and then we'll be sharing those with Dr. Koike.
How do I get out of this? Yikes.
We're going to see another presentation there, looks like.
Por favor. How do I get out of this? Let's see.
Can you do stop share?
Stop share. Aha.
Yeah.
There.
Dr. Koike, thank you very much. I believe the first question that we got in the chat, I think people are still thinking for a minute, but Luz Maria Acosta Natson is asking if she can get a copy of the slides.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I'll give them to Dr. Tokaimasa Hatch. I'm sure she could put them on a website.
Yes, and we are recording this session, so we will be able to share the recording.
That's right. Yeah, that's easier.
Any other questions?
Well, if you do have questions, you can certainly write to me at UT, at the University of Texas. I'm on the Spanish website.
Or any comments? Has anyone used any other resources presented or ideas?
I'm going to ask a question while other people are thinking. Dr. Koike, what do you think about applying a task-based approach to teaching for heritage speakers? I don't know if that is something that has been investigated, and I would like to hear your opinion.
Task-based versus product-based? Are you're distinguishing that? To me, they're very similar. So I
guess I was understanding it as two different things, but maybe they are more similar.
Well, they're very similar. I think product-based language learning has a lot more components to it because it's taking more of the recent research on agency, et cetera, and trying to put it in. And it's also different in the sense of trying to make a product that's used by the community afterwards, and also paying attention or researching the community as you create that product. So I think those are the biggest differences. But I'm all in favor of task-based. The more you can get the student seeing that language learning is a real life thing, it's not something you just do in the classroom and walk out and that's it, the better. When we take groups to Spain, we try to get them into at least, well, not to Spain, it was in Costa Rica. I took a group to Costa Rica, and one group worked in a nursing home, and that opened their eyes. because the way they take care of the elderly, where they put them, etc. Another group was actually able to ride around with an ambulance crew as they went to several emergencies. I don't think they could do that anymore, but they were amazed by how different healthcare was in that country. So these experiential experiences, I think, are just great for learning.
Absolutely. We have a question from Brisa Rabago. So she's asking, if you don't have a heritage speakers class, how would you approach mixed learners?
That is a tough one. Okay, I was thinking about this because I thought for sure, and Dr. Tokaimasa Hutchinson, what if somebody asks you that? So I was thinking, okay, number one, my disclaimer is I'm a university professor, so I don't have a good handle on what goes on in the high schools and the limitations that you have to deal with there. But it seems to me that from the research and from things I've seen done, there you could have a big assignment, for example, preparing a project. And part A, you have a preparation and a planning stage, and what will the students do, who are involved, what are the goals. And a part B, which are the heritage students, those who are usually fewer in a class, do the contact part with the L2 student to get in touch with the community, sort of do the legwork and work together doing the talking to that community member. Or you could have heritage students working with second language learners, not to keep them, I think it's not good to keep them separate in their own group, but to provide information like vocabulary, while the L2 students help with more of the meta language, the identifying a direct and an indirect object. And in case those are asked for in an activity. But of course, the second language learner needs to practice the communication of the language, not just identify parts of speech and other metalinguistic information.
Yes, thank you very much. I see that now we have 3 or 4 longer questions, but what I don't think we have is the time. So, Cecilia, what are your thoughts? Should we send these questions to Dr. Koike later?
I would say let's take a couple more minutes and then
Okay.
Yeah. Mhm.
Okay, so the next question comes from Zoe McMahon, who is asking, often in high school, we don't have heritage speakers class for the higher levels. Heritage speakers are group leaders for the speaking practice. Sometimes they help their peers. It kind of connects with what you were just saying.
I think that's a great idea. I read an article fairly recently, a study on how the actual heritage speakers in those situations feel. Do they feel like they're being put upon by having to do that work and sort of take a leadership role? What if they're really shy and it's not something they want to do? And on the other side, what about the student? Are they made to feel, I don't know, a little bit, have an inferiority complex about this because they're always the subordinate person? So I think the student population in that group has to be looked at carefully before you do those kinds of role playing.
Absolutely. The next question comes from André Brunet, and I believe it's a really interesting question. How do you address issues of trepidation caused by being conscious or aware about regional variations?
How do you talk about regional variations?
How do you address that maybe a student is not feeling comfortable about their own language because of a regional variation.
Right. That does come up in the heritage situation, right? I think that an awareness of what those regional variations are, and not considered as mistakes, but rather what they are, regional variations, has to be made clear from the beginning. And they could be incorporated. I'm for fun, I know you're not going to think this is fun, but for fun, sometimes at night, I read a chapter of the Quixote, and I look at some of those things that they're saying, and they're what the heritage speakers sometimes do. So it's putting it all in perspective, right? These are sometimes just archaisms that have still continued. As Cecilia said, I went to school in New Mexico, and parts of New Mexico have very old 15th century Spanish, and I think that's wonderful. Maybe somebody would be self-conscious about it if they don't hear it in the university setting. So they have to be taught what values and periods are connected with that.
Yes. There is one more question from Anne-Laure Martinez, and she's asking, how do you create this kind of opportunities for service learning, she's talking about service learning, in rural communities where the need of a world language learning is perceived more like a requirement instead of an opportunity?
Ooh, wow! If I had a rural group, I would love to explore that, because I think that they probably need a lot of help if they're lacking products or places, etc. Maybe the students can help make or augment what they have in those settings. I've never lived in a rural community. I'm from East Los Angeles. I've always lived in big cities. I don't know. Cecilia, maybe you have some idea because of the Nebraska context.
So what comes to me right now is, for example, in service learning here at UNO, we have tried really hard in this last year to try to do service learning online, virtual service learning. And I think that one of the things that we have discovered in doing online service learning or virtual service learning because of COVID has been actually that this is also a matter of access, that we can actually reach communities, rural communities more easily. So that's been one of the lessons that we've learned, that there are lots of things we can't do virtually, even if we don't have a community nearby. Like I know in some places in rural Nebraska, maybe there's less of a presence of a Latino community or other communities, not just Spanish, but other communities as well. And I think that we can do lots of things because of the internet these days. Yeah. It takes a little bit more planning, more than the traditional service learning formats that we've seen before.
In all of these scenarios, I think it's going to be more work for the teacher, but I think you can get a very rich set of experiences for your students in those scenarios.
I have one additional question. Do you have recommendations for how to attract heritage learners to the heritage language classes at the university level? Whereas it may not be a requirement, but kind of reaching out to pique their interest in kind of exploring some of these topics and exploring their heritage language and identity.
Yeah, that has been historically at the University of Texas, it's been an issue because there was a period of time when it fell out of favor to be in these classes. But somehow they worked, it got around that the classes actually help you get into the upper division levels where there aren't any separate heritage upper division classes. So they instituted a proficiency test, which determined who gets into these heritage classes. And then they're right up from the beginning, they're able to see that the materials are geared towards their problems and histories, etc. I think just by word of mouth, basically, it got going.
Well, thank you so much for Dr. Koike for being with us today and sharing all this information with us. And thank you all the participants as well, our moderators.